Do you ever get the feeling you are being watched? If you are active in any organization on the left, you probably are.
Another great story based on Frederick L. Collins' book, The FBI in Peace and War. Drama, thrills, action.
In the name of national security, the FBI has paid thousands of civilians to join, spy on, and subvert perfectly legal organizations working for social change in this country. David Sanis, Mary Jo Cook, and Sarah Jane Moore have all served as FBI informers.
I went into a relationship as an undercover operative for the FBI under the assumption that I would be seeking out to bring to trial individuals who were engaged in political bombings. After I had been in the FBI a number of months and had performed with some success for them, I was instructed to begin actually seeking people out to conduct bombings and actually be an individual who would lead a series of bombings. That struck me as slightly unconstitutional. I was also involved in an FBI agent-directed conspiracy to obstruct justice in 3 important radical cases in the Seattle area. And that seemed a little odd, specifically that the Federal Bureau of Investigation, sworn to uphold the Constitution and Bill of Rights, was systematically attempting to obstruct justice, to defy the provisions of the Bill of Rights, etc., in 3 important cases.
What was explained to me was that I was to serve my country in a certain capacity. And the terms of that capacity was I was to be a safety valve, a voice of reason. And other than that, they wanted to know who people were, where they lived. They wanted identification of people. They wanted to know if people had emotional problems. They wanted me there as a woman and functioning as a woman.
What did your informing consist of? What kind of information were you passing on?
In terms of the reports that I filed on this particular man, the answer is everything. Every phone call that I made to him or that he made to me, the meetings that we had, where we met, why that place was chosen, what we talked about, not only political content, but what we talked about in terms of just social conversation, even to the minutia of what he was wearing.
To free the nation from the ever-changing, always ominous Red Menace, the FBI has used infiltrators to collect information on politically active citizens. Informers are often active participants, helping to develop the direction and policy of the organizations they infiltrate. Frequently, they hold positions of leadership. The FBI has even formed sham radical organizations in order to attract the people they are interested in watching. In fact, infiltration is so widespread that there can almost be said to be a second left movement in this country, a shadow of the true left, which is funded, staffed, and directed by the FBI. The legal scope of FBI operations has been increasing since its formation in 1924. Political surveillance is handled by the Bureau's Domestic Intelligence Division, which dates its authority from 1939, when President Franklin Delano Roosevelt ordered the FBI to investigate matters relating to espionage and sabotage. So long as J. Edgar Hoover and his successors to the directorship could convince the legislature that the government is in imminent danger of communist subversion, funds could be obtained for extensive programs of domestic surveillance, programs which are subject to only the most minimal review by elected representatives of the people.
As head of the ACLU's Political Surveillance Project, Frank Donner has done extensive research on FBI informers.
The informer really should be understood as an instrument for perpetuating a myth. And when I say myth, I mean it in more than a metaphorical sense. A myth that the government of the United States is under a permanent threat of internal subversion.
Ron Dellums, a congressman from California and member of the House Select Committee to investigate the intelligence community, has publicly questioned the legitimacy of FBI activity in this area.
I'm sure at one time that Berkeley had more agents in Berkeley than we probably had agents in Moscow, because of the sick mentality in this country of who is the enemy. The enemy is anybody who opposes the policies of the administration, and we use the forces, have used the forces, and I think the documentation is clearly there, the FBI, the CIA, and other agencies, to harass, intimidate, infiltrate, perhaps even assassinate, kidnap, and engage in many, many other insane and very cruel acts.
I grew up thinking that the FBI and the police were the good guys, that their job was to protect, me and mine.
The informer is a key factor in the development of files. That is, the way in which informers' reports are processed by agents on an individual, organizational, and incident level, so as to strengthen the file system. And of course, the file system is extremely important because it's used to support the intelligence thesis that social unrest is produced by individual conspiratorial bad men, cunning and ruthless. It's an attempt to individuate what are fundamentally social problems.
Mary Jo Cook infiltrated the Buffalo, New York chapter of Vietnam Veterans Against the War Winter Soldier Organization.
One of the things that I was very worried about after watching the Watergate testimony was the security of the information that I was passing, because I had passed so much information. I wanted to know whether or not the people that I had informed on would be hurt through that. And I respected those people, and I was very concerned. I wanted to know how much of the information was being sent to Washington, who was going to use it, how it was going to be used. And the answers that I got were not satisfactory. I'd worked for them in what I felt to be an honest capacity, and I'd learned through a whole process of working for them that I could not trust them, that even if they felt they were being honest, that they were lying to themselves a lot, and that they were not being responsible as members of a law enforcement agency, that they were helping to set up their apparatus for 1984, and they didn't even care.
Ralph Stein can guess how much of this information reached Washington. In 1967 and 68, he headed a new left desk for Army intelligence. In that capacity, he processed informers' reports and exchanged files with the FBI and other government agencies.
Some of the information which we received, which is so intensely personal and so violative of virtually any definition of First Amendment rights, that at the time we all began to realize, most of us did anyway, that we were really acquiring the apparatus of a police state.
The First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States of America. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances.
Much of what we now know about FBI infiltration comes from the confessions of former informants and career agents. Internal FBI memoranda provide another source of information. In 1971, files were stolen from the Bureau's office in Media, Pennsylvania, by a group calling itself the Citizens Commission to Investigate the FBI. Information contained in those files has enabled other investigators to obtain more documents by suing the Bureau under the Freedom of Information Act. The heavily censored documents turned over by the FBI as a result of those suits revealed the existence of extensive domestic counterintelligence programs. Called Cointelpros, they used legal and illegal methods to infiltrate, disrupt, and harass politically active citizens.
Congressman Ron Dellums reads from one of these documents.
Counterintelligence program, internal security, disruption of the new left. Our nation is undergoing an era of disruption and violence caused to a large extent by various individuals generally connected with the new left. Some of these activities urge revolution in America and call for the defeat of the United States in Vietnam. They continually and falsely allege police brutality and do not hesitate to utilize unlawful acts to further their so-called causes. The new left has on many occasions viciously and scurrilously attacked the director of the FBI in an attempt to hamper our investigation of it and to drive us off the college campuses. With this in mind, it is our recommendation that a new counterintelligence program be designed to neutralize the new left and the key activists. The key activists are those individuals who are the moving forces behind the new left and on whom we have intensified our investigation, the new left. I think when you get into those kind of labels, there's awesome potential to abuse people. And so you take this kind of statement and you move against any organization that any informant or any agent or any person out there says is a new left group, you automatically says that equals danger, that equals violence, and then you justify a massive program to infiltrate these organizations. Now, what is the role of the government to do this?
Legislative committees have tried to answer that question. In September 1975, Senator Frank Church questioned the former chief of the FBI's Domestic Intelligence Division about former FBI Director Hoover's approval of the large-scale investigation of American college students.
Can you clarify for me which techniques that you're stating the director approved, which would have been illegal?
Well, there were a number of activities included. B of these activities was opening cases on approximately 4,000 black student activists, all members of the black student unions and similar groups, regardless of their past or present involvement in disorders. And it involved the opening cases on approximately 6,500 new left student activists, black and white, to determine whether they have a propensity for violence. Now, how do you investigate a person to find out whether he has a propensity for violence?
How do you investigate a propensity for violence? The FBI's answer is to flood targeted groups with informers who often act as provocateurs.
First agent I ever knew was in SDS, and he was a provocateur. So I didn't trust him, work with him. I thought he was crazy. And so did almost everybody else in the SDS chapter. He was just someone who was just always running his mouth off about, you know, we would want to demonstrate someplace and he'd want to blow it up, only he wanted to blow up a dorm.
David Sanis worked for the FBI in the Seattle area.
If anybody seemed interested in violent solutions, I was out advocating, telling them how to do it, and hoping to get people to want to become involved in it.
From 1968 until 1970, Thomas Tongyai toured college campuses in upstate New York, preaching revolutionary violence. Undergraduates and high school students knew him as Tommy the Traveler and thought he was a regional traveler for SDS. Tommy gave bizarre, contradictory cover stories, constantly promoted violent activities, and never took part in political discussions. In 1970, the ROTC building at Hobart College in Geneva, New York, was bombed. 4 freshmen who had taken part in planning sessions with Tommy were arrested for that action. This is one of those students.
Tommy first thing mentioned that if we wanted to have any black powder, he could supply it. He said, well, if you want black powder, I can get it. And he also said that he would show us if we wanted to learn how to make the bombs. And it was sort of strange because the meeting was such a general type of meeting with no desire to have any sort of definite plan, just discussion. And Tommy said, no, we have to set up a plan. He wanted to get the group involved in planning times and planning a definite date for an action.
Tommy the Traveler gave special attention to Clarence Young, chairman of the Black Student Union at Hobart.
A couple of times he offered, to give me fire bombs to blow up a building on campus, to get guns for me. He said, well, whenever you black students on campus are going to take over a building, I can get the guns for you because I know how to get them. I know where to get them. And it won't cost you anything.
You're listening to Me and My Shadow, Infiltration of the Left by the U.S. Government. It's a documentary produced in 1976 by Addie Gevins and narrated by Don Sorda. We'll return to it in a minute after this break. Welcome back to Democracy Now! And we're going to return to the documentary, the Pacifica Radio documentary that we've been listening to, Me and My Shadow, Infiltration of the Left by the U.S. Government. It was produced in 1976 and is especially relevant now that these hearings are going on in Congress about U.S. government intelligence operations. It was produced by Addie Gevins and narrated by Don Sorda.
Washington calling counter-spy.
Counter-spy calling Washington.
Thomas Edward Mosier was well known to activists at Stanford University and around Palo Alto, California. When he arrived at Stanford in 1969, he presented impressive radical credentials. He had worked with SNCC in Mississippi, with the SDS Join Project in Chicago, and had visited Cuba with SDS in 1968. In 1971, Mosier told a Senate Internal Security Subcommittee that he had acted as an FBI informant under Agent Philip Duncan in Palo Alto.
Herb Borak of the Pacific Studies Center describes Mosier's activities as an FBI provocateur.
He used his contacts, his friendships, associations with different organizations to enhance his credibility with other organizations. He was around people in the SDS National Office in Chicago, which names he could use in working with radicals, with people who thought they were radicals in the Stanford community and with the Panthers. According to his testimony and from observation of people in the area, he was active in the organizing around the United Front Against Fascism in the summer of 1969. People have said that he did offer them dynamite or different kinds of guns. And if you read between the lines in his testimony, it appears that his house, at least, served as a conduit for plastic explosives. He was responsible for using land in the Santa Cruz Mountains for groups that practice guerrilla training. And he mentions bringing people who were in the Revolutionary Union up to the land for this kind of practice.
Most undercover operatives begin informing in exchange for immunity from prosecution or for charges to be dropped. When their identity is discovered, it is usually the result of an accident or when they testify for the prosecution at political trials. A few, like David Sanis, are recruited with appeals to their patriotism. After several years as an informer, Sanis decided he could best serve his country if he stopped working for the FBI and started investigating it.
David Sanis spoke to Bruce Soloway in 1971.
I was asked by the FBI, specifically Bert Carter, special agent and working out of the Seattle office, to commit a violent felony crime. He said it was definitely necessary to establish my credibility as a violent revolutionary. As a result, in late October, I began to hector people about that I'd met 5 people who claimed to be revolutionaries, that if they were really revolutionaries, they ought to be doing a violent action. I finally convinced a group of people, these 5, to work with me to set up a bombing. We planned it out mutually, that is, the FBI and I.
What did you decide to do?
To bomb the Evergreen Point Bridge in the city of Seattle.
Mm-hmm.
Agent Bert Carter finally set the final plan as so as to not damage the bridge, conduct a bombing in which the individual who actually placed the explosive device would be killed in a booby-trapped explosion.
What was the explanation he gave for why that should be part of the plot?
So that the bridge would not be damaged and disrupt traffic flow, so that I would have credibility yet as a bomber, and that this individual would have died in a bombing attempt and thus would have given pause perhaps to other bombers.
How far along did this plan proceed?
right up until it was absolutely mapped out and ready to be set in the first week of December, when I severed my relationship with the FBI.
I grew up thinking that the FBI and the police were the good guys, that their job was to protect, me and mine.
Although it's been getting away with it for years, the FBI's authority for investigating such legally constituted mass organizations as black student unions or the Socialist Workers' Party is open to question. This uncertainty might promote the use of provocateurs. Conspiracy to bomb a federal building or transport explosives across state lines is clearly within the FBI's jurisdiction. Provocateurs are also used to shape the public image of political activists as armed and dangerous maniacs who must be sought out and subdued by the FBI.
You know, a person's first reaction to finding out that they're in an organization which is being watched is, well, why are they watching us? I mean, we're not doing anything illegal, which is true. We weren't, and we're not. And of course, they have to understand why, and people have to explain it to them. You know, why is the state, paying so much attention to an organization whose work is public work? And when you get into that, you get into the whole area of what is a state that looks like it's free, unquote, but in fact is extremely repressive.
In 1973, 8 members of Vietnam Veterans Against the War were brought to trial on charges that they conspired to incite, promote, and participate in a riot at the 1972 Republican National Convention.
Richard Boyle covered that trial for KSAN Radio in San Francisco.
We learned, I think, a lot about the psychology of an agent from the Gainesville conspiracy trial. It turned out in testimony at the trial that they were in fact set up by the government. And they were all found not guilty. They were all acquitted by a jury. The key government witness was William Leamer, who held a high-ranking position in the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. He was a regional coordinator for 2 states, and at the same time while working for the FBI as a paid informer. It turned out later that agents had run 3 of the regions in the South, and Scott Camille, one of the defendants, his region, Florida, his deputy was an agent. So to say there was massive infiltration. In fact, it turned out in the trial that the New Orleans chapter had more agents in it than non-agents. Leamer was recruited when somebody shot at him, missed his head by about a foot. And he went to the FBI, and the FBI said that military intelligence had tried to kill him. However, they would protect him from military intelligence if he'd worked for them. So in fact, they use the stick and the carrot. The stick, they'll blow your brains out. And they told him, well, it was MI that's doing it, military intelligence, not us, And they so terrified him, and they did all sorts of other dirty tricks on him. They messed with his woman. They just barraged him with dirty tricks and psychological bombardment to soften him up, to get him to work for him. However, it turned out later he went back to work for the vets, so he became an effective triple agent. This often happens, that agents are so flaky that they go back and they switch back and forth, sometimes 4 or 5 times. So nobody really knows who they're working for.
Scott Camille, one of the defendants in that trial, has received special attention from federal authorities.
Scott was a national leader of the Vietnam Veterans Against the War, and he was looked upon as a threat by the agents who had seized leadership of many high positions in that organization. And so, consequently, the government tried to set him up. They had a man named Manny Fernandez try to sell him Uzi machine guns. It turned out later Manny Fernandez was working for the FBI, and he was offered $700 a month to work for CREEP, Committee to Re-elect the President. Scott had already suspected that these people were agents. He knew Leamer had confessed that he was an agent. So Scott said no thanks, but he got indicted anyway. Then he was found not guilty, as the other 7 defendants were. And Scott decided to do a book on agent infiltration into the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. And he had names and photographs of many agents who are now in key leadership positions in that organization. After he'd been working on the book for about a year, he was stopped by 2 narcotics agents, shot in the back. And later those agents went through his house, seized his documents, seized his photographs, and all materials relating to that, to his investigation.
There was something in the paper about a woman that he was living with.
Yeah, she turned out to be an agent. The government often uses women or men to get involved in personal relationships with their target and try and win their confidence. And this is apparently what happened to Scott. Scott's second in command in the Florida chapter of the VVW, Florida region, I'm sorry, was an agent. And he admitted being an agent the last day of the trial. The night before, that same agent had sat in on a defense meeting. Agents worm their way into your personal life. Try to do, they often go to great lengths to establish credibility and then turn on you at the last moment.
Somebody's watching. This I know it's true. Somebody's watching. Somebody's watching you. Somebody's watching. Saw ya, saw ya, saw ya, saw ya. Somebody's watching. Somebody's watching you. Somebody's watching.
The Civil Rights Movement, which J. Edgar Hoover frequently described as a collection of communist front organizations, was kept under close surveillance by the FBI. As a more militant black movement began to develop in this country, an ever-broadening FBI shadow accompanied it.
Ron Dillams reads from an FBI document which details a Cointelpro program directed towards what the FBI characterizes as black nationalist hate groups.
To all special agents in charge from the director of the FBI, entitled Counterintelligence Programs, Black Nationalist Hate Groups, Racial Intelligence, to prevent the rise of a messiah who could unify and electrify the militant black nationalist movement. Blank might be such a messiah. He is the mortar of the movement. That may be Malcolm X or so. Blank, blank, and blank all aspire to this position. Blank is less of a threat because of his age. Blank would be a very real contender for this position should he abandon his supposed obedience to white liberal doctrines, nonviolence, and embrace black nationalism. That may very well be Dr. Martin Luther King, who was an advocate of nonviolence. And they said, blank has the necessary charisma to be a real threat in this way.
David Du Bois, editor-in-chief of the Intercommunal News Service of the Black Panther Party, discusses the relationship of the FBI to that organization.
There is a host of evidence suggesting the active participation and involvement of paid agents, informers, and contract agents of the various intelligence services of this country, alleged intelligence services of this country, their participation in the activities of the party as members and as leaders.
Louis Tackwood worked as an undercover informer for the criminal conspiracy section of the Los Angeles Police Department. He claims that he also worked for the FBI. In November 1971, Tackwood testified at the trial of 13 Panther Party members in Los Angeles. That trial stemmed from a 1969 attack on Black Panther headquarters by an FBI-trained SWAT team of the Los Angeles Police Department.
The chief prosecution witness in that trial was Melvin Cotton Smith, a leading member of the LA Panthers at the time of the alleged shootout.
U.S. Deputy District Attorney Ronald H. Carroll maintained that Smith had turned state's evidence to avoid prosecution. Tackwood testified that Smith had been an informer since 1969.
Louis Tackwood's testimony revealed an insider's view of the extent of FBI infiltration.
District Attorney Carroll asked me, I think, one question. What did I know about the Panther Party at the present time? And I think I asked him which one, either the police department's Panther Party or the Panther Party, you know.
There are mountains of evidence that those individuals, some of whom have been revealed, others of whom have not, acted in ways to provoke confrontations between the party and the police and other armed elements of the power structure. The Black Panther Party considers 26 members, former members, as martyrs, having fallen in the course of the struggle, the history of this organization.
Fred Hampton, a Black Panther Party leader, was killed in December 1969 when his apartment was raided by Chicago police. In a suit brought by his family against the FBI and the Chicago Police Department, Hampton's death is attributed to an FBI operative who was serving as his bodyguard.
Rick Wagner of the Center for Constitutional Rights is working on that suit.
With Fred Hampton, we found out as a factual matter that the FBI agent who was the head of Cointelpro in Chicago, had provided the Chicago Police Department with completely fabricated evidence, quote unquote, suggesting that Fred Hampton had been responsible for the killing of a police officer in Chicago several weeks previous to the raid on Fred Hampton's apartment. Clearly that was calculated to enrage an already generally enraged police department, provided the police department with the pretext of raiding Fred Hampton's apartment, which was suggesting to them that they were keeping illegal weapons on the premises, and that Fred Hampton's bodyguard, a man whose name was O'Neill, who had drugged Fred Hampton the night before the raid, was in fact an FBI, not a Chicago police, but an FBI informer who reported directly to the FBI agent.
I think at this point, you know, in the United States, that more than the pigs trying to kill somebody that's in a leadership position.
On Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. As we turn now to part 2 of the documentary produced by Addie Gevins in 1976 called Me and My Shadow, looking at FBI infiltration of the left in this country, particularly bringing out the voices of agents provocateurs. This is the end of Me and My Shadow.
In recent years, the Justice Department has brought many activists to trial, often on unprosecutable conspiracy charges in order to deplete the funds and energies of the left. Support groups organized around the defense at these trials have become a major focus for FBI infiltration and harassment. Informers report on the private lives and political activities of committee members, defendants, and lawyers, and supply information on defense strategy to the Justice Department. As part of her work in the Buffalo, New York chapter of VVAW-WSO, Mary Jo Cook penetrated an Attica Brothers defense organization. On April 5, 1975, John Hill was convicted of murder and Charles Pernacelice was convicted of second-degree assault in connection with the death of guard William Quinn during the September 1971 uprising in Attica Prison. On April 12th, Mary Jo Cook testified that she had supplied her FBI control agent with details of defense legal strategies. She felt that this information was essential to the attainment of convictions in both cases.
Bruce Soloway of Attica Now.
The main work that she did with us was in the jury selection project. It's a process by which we can analyze the makeup of the population in this area to such an extent that by asking certain questions in jury selection proceedings, we can get a pretty fair idea of what the general attitudes and the likelihood of open-mindedness, let's say, on the part of the various potential jurors is. And it's kept very secret, and it appeared to us, and it appeared to the people working on the jury selection in the case of John Hill and Charlie Joe Pernacelice, that the prosecution seemed to know our system, and everybody felt that that had been partially explained when Mary Jo surfaced after the trial and confessed that she was an FBI informer and did have access to that information. The issue in this hearing became whether or not the FBI had passed that information on to the prosecutors. That's the missing link that was never really established in this hearing. The FBI agent who was her contact said that she had given some information on the Attica defense, but that it was insignificant.
American Indian Movement defense committees were skillfully penetrated by Douglas Durham, an undercover FBI informant.
Melinda Rorick.
Durham could pass as an Indian and had a great deal of past experience, had worked on a police force for, I believe, 5 or 6 years prior to becoming an informant. He got into the local AIM chapter, quickly rose to the top of that chapter, and then led an occupation of a building which was totally arranged with the FBI, and developed credibility with National AIM with that occupation, and met Dennis Banks and became close to Banks. He had a great many skills. He put full-time work into AIM, and that's exactly what AIM needed. What he rose to was the chief of security for National AIM. He was also the coordinator of the Banks Means trial in St. Paul, Minneapolis. So it meant that everyone who was coming to do anything around that trial had to go through security checks with Durham.
Ken Tilson, AIM lawyer.
In every organization, the person to look at first as a possible FBI agent is the person who has in charge of the security list and who can determine if other people are secure enough to work in the organization.
The trial took months to happen, and it was a very full-blown political trial where Durham was the only person besides the people involved in the trial itself who had access to every meeting that took place, every legal meeting where a lawyer and witness would be going over testimony. This came out in the second round of leadership trials that was just happened earlier this summer, where the defense subpoenaed documents from the FBI about informants inside of the movement. They admitted that Durham had made reports of what was going on inside of the defense committee, but what the government said was that they didn't act off of information that he gave them.
Gene Friedman, BVAW-WSO.
In a movement that's beginning to grapple seriously with Marxism-Leninism in this country and trying to understand how to apply it, what that means, sending in people who seem to have a knowledge of Marxism-Leninism and who apply it in ways that are a little bit weird or different from the way you do can start or escalate a political struggle. Therefore, I think the other thing that we can expect is that the state will have to send in ideologically equipped agents. That is, people who can use Marxism-Leninism to argue, to struggle against what other people are saying and fight at that level, which at the very least will keep things very confused and split for a long time.
Gene's theory is probably accurate. In a June 1975 interview, KPFA's Larry Bensky asked Sarah Jane Moore if the FBI was interested in...
They were interested in the political doctrine of anyone that I was moving with at that time, and they were interested in how I felt about it, what kinds of things I was being asked to study.
Did you find that your control officer had a knowledgeable political background so that he could distinguish between groups on the left?
Yes. Yes, the man is a brilliant man and is extremely well-versed in all of the political groups on the left, in the, what their various doctrines and philosophies and political line was.
There is additional evidence that the FBI is using undercover informants to manipulate the political direction of the left. In February 1975, Joseph A. Burton, a major figure in radical circles in Tampa, Florida, broke cover to tell John Crusden of the New York Times about his activities as an undercover operative. For 2 years, beginning in May 1972, Burton led the Red Star Cadre, a revolutionary organization which he formed at the direction of the FBI. He successfully attracted people the FBI was interested in watching to his group by promoting a radical Maoist philosophy. As he expresses them, Burton's instructions from the Bureau were, don't do anything to bring Marxist-Leninists together. Do anything to prevent them from coming together. A similar organization, this one called the Red Collective, was formed in New Orleans by Jai and Jill Schaefer, both undercover operatives for the FBI. Jai Schaefer was also active in Vietnam Veterans Against the War and at Wounded Knee during the occupation. Melinda Rorick was there.
When Schaefer came in, the occupation had been going on for about 2 weeks. The people had inside very little food, very few weapons, and virtually no resources. They were surrounded by hundreds of FBI agents, U.S. Marshals, military weapons. The people were in great need. Schaefer came in offering all kinds of material assistance. He spoke of himself as a revolutionary. He had a long history that he spoke to often, and really said he wanted to materially aid people. If they could make themselves clear, then he was willing to help. He had a pilot's license, and at that time it was very difficult to get things into Wounded Knee.
And what was he offering to bring in, food or weapons?
He was offering weapons.
Ken Tilson, AIM lawyer.
He never did fly anything into Wounded Knee. What he did was call around the country for guns. I met him there at the Wounded Knee Legal Defense Committee, and after I heard Jai Schaefer speak quite irrationally, I asked him to leave the office. He threatened to kill me, said he was a Maoist and he wasn't going to put up with any of this revisionist stuff, and a bunch of people surrounded me and prevented an assault. Last time I saw him, he was rummaging in the files in the Wounded Knee office, or around the files, and I had told him he had no business there and there was no reason for him to be around and he should leave. And on that occasion, he again threatened to kill me, and this time he was really going to have at it. And it was at that point that some of the AIM people came over and physically threw him out. All of this time, his rhetoric was that he was a Maoist revolutionary and he didn't have to put up with any of this BS from anybody else.
Are you beginning to feel a bit paranoid?
Bob Hood, VVAW, WSO.
Paranoia means to be afraid of something that's not real, or that's not there. And to be afraid of agents, to be afraid of infiltrators, is a very real fear. And I think something that should be dealt with in an intelligent fashion.
Melinda Rourke and Gene Friedman.
Personally, what I look to is to see whether a person is divisive, and not even specifically looking to whether they're an agent or not. But if a person is divisive, then they're not being of use to the organization.
There are lots of things that organizations can do. One of the things is to have a way to legitimize those fears. If someone in an organization thinks that someone else is strange, has said something strange, is acting strangely, there ought to be a way to say that to someone responsible who will listen. And it ought to be checked out, and there are ways to check it out. I mean, you can in fact find out if someone went to college where they say they did, or if someone graduated from a certain high school in a certain town when they say they did, or if that's not their name at all. And that information is accessible right now to us.
Hopefully we're moving to an understanding ourselves of the necessity of those checks, and we won't see it as paranoia building, but that it's something that every individual inside of an organization goes through, and that we don't see it as anything out of the ordinary, and it doesn't, like isolate someone as under suspicion, because that suspicion is the most divisive thing that we have inside of our own organizations.
Bruce Soloway posed a crucial question to David Sanis.
Is there any way that you know of that any common quality perhaps that undercover agents have that make them recognizable?
No, if they did have such, obviously it'd be exploited in their...
To Me and My Shadow, the U.S. government's infiltration of the left. It is a Pacifica radio documentary that was produced in 1976 by Addie Gevins, narrated by Don Sorda. And that does it for today's program. If you want to order a cassette copy of the radio documentary Me and My Shadow, call 1-800-735-0230. That's 1-800-735-0230. Democracy Now!'s website is democracynow.org. You can email us at mail, M-A-I-L, at democracynow.org. Democracy Now! Is produced by Chris Abrams, Miranda Kennedy, Lizzie Ratner, and Michael Ye. Anthony Sloan is our engineer and music maestro. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for listening to another edition of Democracy Now!